unfold.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are looking at something so small, so seemingly trivial, that its enormous historical and economic impact is routinely lost in the shadow of bigger, noisier inventions. We are talking about a simple container made of wood and glass, the Wardian Case.
It sounds so unassuming, doesn't it? Like something you might find in a Victorian drawing room, maybe a piece of furniture, or just a little terrarium for ferns.
Exactly.
But our sources, well, they confirmed that the Wardian Case was actually an unexpected, almost invisible engine of empire.
An engine of empire, that's a huge claim for a glass box.
It is, but we're looking at a piece of technology whose disruptive effect on global economics and biology, it arguably rivals that of the steam engine or the telegraph.
Wow.
It was that critical in enabling what historians call the Great Divergence, that sharp economic separation that just exploded between the West and the global South.
Okay, let's unpack this because that is a powerful, powerful premise. We've got a mountain of evidence here detailing how this glass arc, as you could call it.
The glass arc, I like that.
How this mobile miniature greenhouse broke biological barriers that had, for centuries, protected some of the world's most valuable resources. So our mission today is specific. We need to analyze how this one single piece of technology overcame these immense geographical constraints, how it functioned as really the primary instrument of what you could call botanical imperialism.
Yeah, we're essentially tracking the movement of stolen biological wealth.
Exactly. And we're going to trace that route through 3 crucial world-altering resource transfers: tea, rubber, and quinine.
And to really get the magnitude of this breakthrough, you have to understand the context. The 19th century, it was just this relentless, aggressive, highly organized push by European powers to physically redistribute the world's plants.
They weren't just content with controlling trade routes.
No, not at all. They needed control over the means of production. They understood that economic power, real hegemony, required moving the living source of wealth, what they literally called green gold, out of the hands of indigenous peoples and rival governments.
And planting it in territories they controlled.
Precisely. They had the ships, they had the science, the political will, the capital. Everything was in place.
But until this little glass box, they utterly lacked the one thing they needed most: a reliable, scalable method to move a live plant halfway across the planet.
That's the key friction point. Before Dr. Ward's invention around 1830, the global movement of commercially valuable plants was it was stuck. It was constrained by the severe, intractable technological bottleneck.
It's just amazing to think about.
For hundreds of years, the age of sail was fundamentally, you could say violently, hostile to any kind of plant life you put on a ship.
And these were the East Indiamen we're talking about. I mean, these were the largest, most technologically sophisticated sailing ships in the world. They could weather hurricanes, traverse the entire globe, yet they couldn't keep a shipment of seedlings alive.
It was almost laughably difficult. Historians actually call this period of failure the pre-Wardian mortality matrix.
A mortality matrix sounds ominous.
It was. If you put a shipment of, say, high-value plants on the deck of one of these massive vessels, they faced a complex gauntlet of 4 specific lethal variables. And this is on voyages that could easily stretch between 6 and 9 brutal months.
Okay, so let's walk through those. Let's start with the most obvious killer, just the sea itself.
The first one was relentless salt spray and desiccation. Just imagine a journey of hundreds of days where the air is constantly saturated with salt. That salty mist would coat the leaves of the plants, and it would literally clog their stomata. Those are the microscopic pores they use for respiration.
So the plant can't breathe?
It can't breathe, it can't perform gas exchange, and at the same time, the salt is just sucking the moisture right out of it. It's basically continuous, slow poisoning and suffocation.
And even if you could somehow protect a plant from the worst of the spray, they immediately face the second killer, which is just simple thirst.
Absolutely. Variable number 2, freshwater scarcity. On these long voyages, freshwater was the single most critical finite resource. It was rationed so strictly for the crew's survival.
Of course.
And the sources confirm that captains, in times of shortage, which happened all the time, especially rounding the Cape, They would routinely deny any fresh water to botanical cargoes. Every single drop was for the sailors.
So even if the salt didn't kill them, they just died of thirst.
They just wither away long before they ever saw land.
So we have salt and thirst wiping out plants on the deck. But these ships, they're traveling through every climatic extreme the world has to offer.
And that brings us to variable number 3, thermal shock. This is what they called the torture test of the global rail.
Torture test.
A ship sailing from, say, London to Calcutta would have to cross the equator, right? Temperatures would soar above 30 degrees Celsius for weeks on end, just baking the plants.
Yeah, right.
And then almost immediately afterwards, they'd be rounding the Cape of Good Hope, or even worse, Cape Horn, where temperatures would plummet, often below freezing, sometimes down to -7 Celsius.
No plant can survive that. The kind of violent swing between roasting and freezing.
No delicate, freshly collected plant could withstand that. It's just impossible.
So the obvious solution seems to be, okay, let's just move the plants below deck, but then you run into the fourth and final lethal variable.
Exactly, and that was phototoxicity and etiolation. You store the plants below deck, away from the spray, and they suffer from etiolation. They stretch and blanch into these sickly yellow-white stalks, just desperately seeking any hint of light.
And the hold itself is just a horrible environment.
It's a petri dish. Imagine the smell. Damp, stagnant, unventilated air, often contaminated by bilge water or even waste from livestock on board. It was a perfect breeding ground for fungal rot and mildew.
So it's a complete no-win scenario.
Totally. Either they were salted and roasted on the deck, or they rotted and starved of light in the dark, fetid hold.
And that statistical reality, the fact that biology itself was securing these monopolies, that's what really frustrated the imperial ambitions of the time.
The figures are truly shocking. There was a famous nurseryman from Hackney, George Lottages. He tried desperately to import foreign species, and he reported that he frequently lost 19 out of every 20 plants he tried to import.
19 out of 20. A 5% survival rate. You can't build an industry on that.
No way. It's commercially and imperially impossible.
And John Livingstone, he was an East India Company surgeon, he gave an even grimmer assessment after a voyage in 1819.
Livingstone calculated that for every single plant that somehow miraculously survived the voyage from China to England in that era, 1,000 were lost.
1,000 to 1.
We are talking about a 0.1% survival rate. This massive, consistent failure explains precisely why China's monopoly on tea and the Andean Republic's monopoly on quinine and Brazil's on rubber. They all remained intact.
The biology of distance was just too powerful.
It was a fortress that human technology just couldn't breach.
So, with the full resources of the British Admiralty, Kew Gardens, the East India Company, all of them failing miserably, the eventual solution to this massive global problem arose. And it came not from government science, but from this highly unlikely figure, a London physician named Dr. Nathaniel Ward.
What makes this story so compelling is that the solution emerged not from an effort to solve this global problem, but from Ward's own personal struggle with a very local urban one.
Right. He lived in Wellclose Square, Whitechapel, right next to the docks.
And in the 1820s, that area was just choked with coal smoke and industrial pollution. The air in his garden was this toxic, visible mixture of soot and sulfuric acid fumes, but the Victorians just called London smog.
And this smog was killing his garden.
It repeatedly killed every attempt he made to cultivate ferns and mosses on his rock wall. Everything just died.
So the great irony here is that the very pollution that ruined his private little garden inspired the technology that eventually allowed the West to industrialize global nature.
Exactly. And the discovery itself was completely accidental, which just adds to the poetry of the whole story. It happened in the summer of 1829.
What was he even trying to do?
Well, Ward, besides being a doctor, was also an avid entomologist. He was trying to observe the pupa of a sphinx moth. He placed the chrysalis in some moist leaf mold inside a wide-mouthed glass bottle, and then he sealed it with a tin lid, just intending to watch it transform.
So the intended experiment, the moth experiment, it failed immediately. The moth never emerged.
Precisely. But spontaneously, something else happened. A botanical phenomenon occurred. Without ever being watered, a common male fern and a little sprout of meadow grass germinated from the soil inside that sealed jar.
And it didn't just germinate, it survived in there.
It survived and thrived for nearly 4 years, entirely self-sustained in a sealed bottle.
Wow.
And Ward's true stroke of genius wasn't the accidental setup. It was his intensely critical observation of the physics at work inside that bottle. He saw the potential to defeat all 4 of those lethal variables of sea travel.
Okay, so let's break down those mechanics in detail, because this is the specific technological leap that changes everything.
The fundamental key was what he identified as the closed hydrological cycle.
Right.
So think about what happens inside a sealed glass container. During the day, moisture naturally evaporates from the soil and it transpires off the leaves.
Okay.
Since the glass walls were a little cooler than the air inside, that moisture immediately condensed into tiny droplets on the inner surface.
Like condensation on a cold drink.
Exactly. And then at night, as the temperature dropped, that water would run back down the glass and right back into the soil.
So it created its own perpetual miniature rain cycle, a self-watering system.
A perfect perpetual self-watering cycle. This mechanism maintained constant perfect humidity without needing to add any fresh water for months and months on end. It simultaneously defeated the problem of freshwater scarcity and rapid desiccation.
It's botanical perpetual motion.
It really is. And the second critical component was, of course, the seal itself.
The seal was the key to keeping the bad stuff out.
On land, it kept out the lethal coal soot and sulfuric acid. But on a ship, that hermetic seal, which he made using tightly fitted glass panes, sealed with thick putty and rot-resistant wood like teak, it prevented the lethal salt spray and wind from ever getting in.
And crucially, the glass still lets in the light for photosynthesis.
It created a miniature self-sustaining biome, completely buffered from the brutal external world.
But the world's botanists and the Admiralty, they must have been incredibly skeptical of this. It sounds almost too simple coming from a Docklands physician.
Oh, there was definitely skepticism. It had to be tested under the sheer brutality of a real global shipping route. So Ward adapted his bottle concept into larger, transportable glazed wooden cases.
And this leads to the definitive field test in 1833.
The famous Persian experiment, yes. Ward packed 2 of his newly constructed cases with common British ferns and grasses. He gave them to a Captain Charles Mallard of the ship Persian, which was bound for Sydney.
And that route was specifically chosen to be as punishing as possible.
Maximum climatic stress. Crossing the equator, sailing through the doldrums, enduring weeks of open ocean spray rounding the Cape. The works.
And what was the result when they arrived in Australia?
They arrived in Sydney months later, and Captain Mallard reported that the plants were in vigorous health. The grasses had actually grown right to the top of the case. They were bursting with life.
But the true test, the absolute test, was the return leg.
Right, which was designed to be even more punishing. They emptied the cases in Sydney and refilled them with delicate Australian species, including a coral fern, and then they shipped them back to London via the notorious Cape Horn route.
Cape Horn, that's a staggering journey.
It lasted 8 months. And during that transit, those cases endured temperature fluctuations from a freezing -7 Celsius off South America to an unbearable 49 Celsius sitting on the deck in the tropics.
And the most astonishing part.
Not a single drop of water was added for the entire 8 months.
That's incredible. The self-sustaining system worked flawlessly.
It proved the technology could withstand the full torture test of global travel. And when the ship got back to London, the plants were immediately inspected by Lottages, the nurseryman.
The one who had the 5% survival rate.
The very same. And Lottages confirmed that the survival rate had shifted from that dismal, commercially unviable 5%, or the East India Company's 0.1%, to an astonishing, industry-altering 95% survival rate.
95%.
19 out of 20 plants surviving instead of dying. That logistical inversion was the key that unlocked global botanical transfer. It mobilized the imperial machine for the next 100 years.
So once that logistical bottleneck was just completely removed, the empire immediately turned its attention to its most urgent strategic vulnerability, tea. And this wasn't just about taste or luxury. This was about massive geopolitical and financial pressure.
That's right. By the mid-19th century, tea was more than a luxury. It was a foundational working-class staple in Britain. The government got enormous revenue from the taxes on it. But the entire vast supply of this national obsession was controlled completely by the Qing dynasty in China.
And Britain was just hemorrhaging silver to pay for it?
The trade imbalance was catastrophic. The Chinese demanded payment for tea only in silver bullion, and it was draining Britain's treasury. So to balance this deficit, Britain resorted to exporting massive quantities of opium grown in India into China.
So they were effectively funding their tea habit by creating a drug crisis.
Pretty much. And this led directly to the Opium Wars. It destabilized the whole region. The East India Company desperately needed a sustainable internal solution. They had to bypass China completely.
The goal then was to transplant the entire centuries-old Chinese tea industry into British territories in the Himalayas and Assam.
Exactly. They knew that the local Indian tea varieties produced a brew that Europeans found too strong, too bitter. The market demanded the delicate Chinese variety Camellia sinensis var.
So the plant and the process for making it had to be stolen.
It had to be stolen. And the man chosen for this monumental mission of industrial espionage was Robert Fortune, a Scottish botanist whose story really does sound like something out of a thriller.
So Fortune was commissioned in 1848 with a dual mandate.
Right.
Get the plants and get the manufacturing secrets.
Right. Infiltrate the forbidden, heavily guarded tea-growing interior of China, collect the best seeds and plants, and just as important, uncover the state secrets of how they actually process the tea.
And the lengths he went to for this subterfuge are just astonishing.
He had to completely shed his identity as a foreigner, an act that was punishable by death if he was discovered. Fortune shaved the front of his head, he wore a fake pigtail, the queue, and he put on the expensive silk robes of a wealthy Mandarin official.
Wow.
And he traveled deep into the forbidden interior, passing himself off as an official from a distant province, all with the help of his loyal Chinese servant, Wang.
And his espionage, it didn't just yield plants, it yielded critical intelligence.
Two major intellectual breakthroughs. First, he provided the botanical knowledge that definitively proved that green tea and black tea came from the exact same plant.
Okay, so the difference was just in the processing.
Only in the processing, specifically the fermentation. And second, he uncovered some shocking manufacturing secrets about the tea being exported.
The story about them coloring the green tea.
He found that Chinese merchants were regularly using a toxic dye, Prussian blue, and iron ferrocyanide and gypsum to enhance the color of green tea leaves destined for export.
Why? Just make it look more appealing.
To make it look more vibrant and appealing to Western consumers who didn't know any better, it caused a huge scandal back in Britain when it was published.
But the core logistical problem of moving the plants was still there. Even Fortune initially failed trying to ship the seeds conventionally.
His first attempts were a total disaster. Tea seeds lose their viability very quickly, and thousands of seeds that he packed in loose crates just germinated prematurely in the humid ship holds and rotted before they ever reached Calcutta.
So he learned the hard way that the Wardian Case was the only option.
The only viable transport method. So for his decisive massive shipments in 1849 and 1851, Fortune used the cases as a sophisticated mobile nursery.
A mobile nursery. How did that work?
Instead of trying to ship dormant, perishable seeds, he sowed the seeds directly into rich soil inside the cases before they left China. The seeds then germinated en route, protected by the seal from salt and wind, and they arrived in the Himalayas not as weak seeds, but as established, resilient seedlings.
That allowed for an incredible scale that was just unimaginable before.
It did. Fortune successfully shipped nearly 20,000 plants and viable seedlings from Shanghai to Calcutta. And he used the faster P&O steamships, which cut the transit time even further. It was a combination of steam speed and the protection of the glass arc.
And he didn't just move the hardware, the plants, he moved the human software of the industry too.
A crucial detail. Fortune recruited 8 Chinese tea experts, 6 master tea manufacturers who knew the secrets of fermentation, and 2 specialist pewterers who understood how to line the tea chests to keep it fresh.
So he brought them to India to train the local workforce.
Exactly. It was a comprehensive transfer. The plant genetics, the processing knowledge, and the skilled labor.
And the economic consequences for China were just swift and devastating.
The infusion of Fortune's plants and expertise immediately fueled the new Indian tea industry. It formed the genetic basis for the high-altitude Darjeeling and Assam plantations we know today.
And the numbers tell the story.
They do. In 1853, Indian tea exports were negligible, less than 200 tons. By 1885, that figure had exploded to over 35,000 tons.
And the symbolic tipping point.
That came in 1904. That was the year Indian tea exports to Britain surpassed Chinese exports for the very first time. The British Empire had successfully internalized the entire tea trade, dismantling China's primary source of revenue. And it was all thanks to a handful of glass boxes protecting 20,000 little seedlings.
So if tea funded the empire's coffers, the next major target, rubber, provided the sinew for the industrial and military machines that protected it.
We're talking about the substance that became essential for vulcanization, industrial gaskets, hoses, and critically, the tires needed for the bicycle craze and the very beginnings of the auto industry.
The world needed rubber. And until the late 19th century, that high-quality latex came from exactly one source.
The 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 brasiliensis tree, growing wild and scattered throughout the vast, dense Amazon basin.
Which meant Brazil had a complete 100% monopoly. This led to that legendary rubber boom that saw cities like Manaus transform into these incredibly opulent, gilded places built entirely on latex.
Manaus built its opera house. They famously paid to have streetlights installed long before most European capitals. And the Brazilian government guarded its source of wealth very tightly. But the natural barriers to theft were even more formidable than the ones protecting tea.
We're back to a biological barrier securing the monopoly. What was so special about the rubber seeds?
It's their recalcitrance. The seeds of the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 tree are highly recalcitrant. Basically, they're oily, and they're designed by nature to germinate immediately upon falling to the damp jungle floor.
So they can't be stored.
Exactly. If they dry out, even slightly, they lose their viability completely. That biological expiration date, which is just a few weeks, made transportation on slow-sailing ships utterly impossible. You couldn't move 70,000 seeds if the journey took 2 months.
So enter Henry Wickham in 1876. The man often called the bio-pirate of the Amazon, commissioned by the India office in Kew Gardens to break this stranglehold.
Wickham's mission was a high-stakes race against biology. He collected an estimated 70,000 seeds from the Tapajós River region, and his whole operation hinged on defeating that time constraint.
Which meant relying not just on the Wardian case, but on steamship speed and, well, a bit of high-level deception.
A lot of deception. For the speed, he chartered the fast steamship SS Amazonas, which just happened to be in port without a full cargo. He rushed the seeds aboard, aiming for a direct, rapid transit across the Atlantic to Liverpool to beat that biological clock.
And what's this story about the deception at the customs office in Belém?
Well, Wickham later claimed that when he reached the port, the official in charge was holding up the clearance papers, which would have doomed the entire fragile cargo.
A fatal delay.
So Wickham allegedly approached the customs head and declared the 70,000 seeds as exceedingly delicate botanical specimens specially designated for delivery to Her Britannic Majesty's own royal gardens.
He pulled the royalty card.
He exploited the official's reverence for the crown. And whether it's fully true or a bit of an exaggeration, it worked. The papers were signed immediately.
So the steamship gets the seeds across the Atlantic in time. But the Wardian case was still necessary for that final, crucial leg of the journey to Asia.
Absolutely. Because despite the ship's speed, the initial mortality rate was still high. Of the 70,000 seeds collected, only about 2,700 managed to germinate in the hothouses at Kew Gardens. That's a success rate of about 4%.
But those 2,700 seedlings were everything.
They represented the genetic bottleneck through which the entire massive Asian rubber industry would pass. Every single plantation tree came from that tiny initial stock.
And to safely transport those incredibly precious seedlings across the world again.
In August 1876, 1,919 of those fragile seedlings were carefully packed into 38 Wardian cases. They were loaded aboard a Duke of Devonshire, destined for Ceylon and Singapore. The cases were the protected bridge, shielding the vulnerable Amazonian plants from the intense heat of the Red Sea crossing.
And that small genetic pool transferred in that handful of cases, it led to a total economic and ecological inversion.
It was rapid and devastating for Brazil, because it wasn't just about moving the trees, it was about moving them away from their natural enemy.
You mean the leaf blight?
Exactly. In the Amazon, 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 trees have to grow sparsely, widely distributed, to avoid the native fungal pathogen Microcyclus ule, the South American leaf blight, which just decimates dense stands of trees.
But in Southeast Asia?
Separated from that blight by 2 oceans, the trees could be grown in dense, high-yield, easily managed plantations. They gained this incredible ecological advantage that Brazil could never match.
And the economic data just shows total annihilation for the Amazonian rubber baron.
In 1900, the Amazon still produced over 95% of the world's rubber. But as the Wardian transferred seedlings matured, plantation rubber from Malaya and Ceylon just flooded the market. By 1928, the Amazon's share of global production had collapsed to a negligible 2.3%.
The entire regional economy was just decimated.
Annihilated. And Britain secured the supply of a strategic material that was essential for the mechanized armies of World War I and World War II.
And there's that fascinating historical footnote that absolutely proves the point about the leaf blight, the colossal failure of Fordlandia.
Oh, it's the perfect epilogue. Henry Ford, convinced that the British were criminally manipulating rubber prices, decided to establish his own massive plantations in Brazil in the 1920s.
He was going to bypass the British system.
He was going to create his own supply chain. But despite billions of dollars of investment, Ford failed catastrophically due to the very leaf blight Microcyclus uli that the Wardian transfer had successfully evaded decades earlier. The glass box proved smarter than the industrial might of Henry Ford.
We've covered tea for the economy and rubber for industry. Now we turn to quinine, the resource that literally fueled the physical expansion of the empire itself. It allowed Europeans to live where they previously could only die.
Quinine was the empire's essential health security. Malaria was the single greatest check on European colonization in tropical Asia and Africa. The death rates for Europeans in these so-called white man's graves were astronomical.
And the only effective cure at the time was quinine.
An alkaloid that came exclusively from the bark of the cinchona tree, Peruvian bark, which was endemic to the high cloud forests of the Andes.
So this was the ultimate case of biology blocking imperial ambition. Europeans couldn't consolidate control over huge parts of the globe without a reliable, cheap supply of quinine.
Right, and this geopolitical risk was made worse by unsustainable harvesting. The Andean republics were, understandably, prohibiting the export of live plants to protect their monopoly.
But their own harvesting methods were destroying the supply.
They were felling the entire tree just to strip the bark. London feared the ultimate extinction of the source of the empire's health security.
So another transfer mission was launched, this time under Clements Markham.
Markham's mission in 1859 was to secure cinchona germplasm to plant in the Nilgiri Hills of British India. And the logistical challenge here was perhaps the most acute yet, because these were high-altitude plants.
Transporting plants that thrive in cool, misty air down to a scorching coast and then across the tropics. It just sounds like botanical suicide.
It was incredibly perilous. Markham and his teams faced altitude sickness, hostile local officials, and this fundamental problem of moving high-altitude specimens that were highly susceptible to rot through scorching tropical heat.
So they had to get them down from the mountains to the port.
They had to carry these delicate specimens down treacherous mountain trails to the port of Ijlay in Peru. And once again, the Wardian case was the key technological solution.
For temperature and humidity regulation.
Exactly. Markham used the cases to transport the delicate, moisture-sensitive specimens from South America to India via the searing heat of the Red Sea. The sealed cases created a stable, protected microenvironment. They could move these high-altitude plants through the tropics without them rotting or dying from thermal shock.
And that effort ultimately ensured enough genetic material survived to establish thriving plantations in India and later in Ceylon.
The consequence was monumental. The successful naturalization of cinchona drastically reduced the cost and improved the reliability of the quinine supply. The historian Daniel Hedrick famously classified quinine as a primary tool of empire.
Right up there with the machine gun and the steamship.
Because cheap quinine allowed European powers to physically occupy the interior of Africa and Asia. It allowed them to survive in the white man's grave and consolidate control. By the late 19th century, Dutch plantations in Java, also established via Wardian transfers, dominated the global market, ending the Andean monopoly.
The Wardian case was the delivery vehicle for the cure that unlocked the conquest of the tropics.
It was.
We've focused entirely on the intended consequences, the economic transfers, the destruction of monopolies. But the Wardian case, like any technology that breaks a fundamental barrier, had a massive, often destructive, ecological shadow.
It did. While we celebrate its efficiency as an ark for these valuable economic plants, it was an entirely indiscriminate vessel. It didn't just move the tea or the rubber. It moved entire micro-ecosystems nestled within the soil that was needed to sustain the plants on that long voyage.
So what exactly was riding along in that rich, moist soil?
Everything. The soil was a dense microbial environment. It had nematodes, earthworms, ants, insect eggs, fungi, and critically, thousands of weed seeds. The case protected all of it.
I see.
Even Sir Joseph Hooker, the director of Kew Gardens, who used the cases all the time, sometimes called failed shipments, Ward's coffins. And that name applies just as well to the native ecosystems they eventually carried and irreversibly disrupted.
So it was a primary driver of invasive species.
Absolutely. One analysis suggests that 9 out of 10 invertebrate pests found in the UK arrived on live plants during this period, and many were facilitated by the protected transport the Wardian cases offered. They were perfect Trojan horses for global pestilence.
And we have a perfect, devastating illustration of this with a pathogen that relates directly to the crops we just discussed.
The large-scale movement of plant material during this era is heavily implicated in the rapid global spread of 𝐏𝐿𝐿 coffee leaf rust.
Coffee leaf rust.
This devastating fungus arrived, and in the 1870s, it utterly annihilated the previously thriving coffee industry in Ceylon, wiped it out.
The profound irony being that the collapse of Ceylon's coffee industry forced planters to switch to which crops?
To tea and ribber, the very crops that had been safely established on the island, courtesy of Wardian transfers, a few decades earlier.
That's unbelievable.
The glass arc was so effective at transporting economic plants that it inadvertently created the resilient monoculture system that allowed planters to survive the destruction it had, in part, facilitated. It's a complete double-edged sword.
Beyond pathogens, the case also enabled another profound ecological risk: genetic erosion and monoculture fragility.
The perfect, everyday modern example of this is the banana you buy at the supermarket today, the Cavendish.
The Cavendish banana.
Its origin story is traceable back to a single Wardian case shipment in the 1830s. Joseph Paxton, the Duke of Devonshire's gardener, received a single specimen of Musa acuminata from Mauritius, transported in one of the earliest Wardian cases to his greenhouse.
Wait, so the entire world's export crop comes from the lineage of a single plant?
Precisely. Missionaries later took offspring clones of this single plant and transported them, again using Wardian cases, to the South Pacific. Today, the Cavendish banana dominates the global export market, but because it's grown through vegetative propagation, it is genetically identical to that original plant from the 1830s.
And this total genetic uniformity means that if a new disease emerges, the entire global supply is at risk.
It creates a catastrophic vulnerability. That lack of genetic diversity makes the crop uniquely susceptible to rapidly evolving diseases like Panama disease or fusarium wilt. The extreme fragility of the world's most exported fruit is directly traceable to the specific genetic material that was moved in that one single glass box.
It was an engine of globalization, but also an engine of biological homogenization.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So let's zoom out one final time and synthesize the total economic impact. We started by saying the Wardian case was a vector for the Great Divergence. How do we formalize that economic argument?
Well, the Wardian case was the key piece of technology that allowed capital-rich, technology-rich powers to systematically appropriate the biological resources of the global South. It was the tool that fundamentally separated a high-value cash crop from its native geography and its native labor force.
And this is the concept our sources call botanical arbitrage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Arbitrage is exploiting a price difference between two markets. In this case, the empire used the Wardian case to take a high-value plant from a high-cost or politically difficult region like China or Manaus and move it to a region with cheap, exploitable labor, reliable political control, and better ecological conditions like India or Malaya.
It sounds like the very foundation of modern agribusiness.
Exactly. The Wardian case transformed nature into mobile capital. It turned plants from geographically bound resources into mobile commodities. Production was no longer dictated by native geography, but by imperial efficiency and political control. It fundamentally restructured global wealth.
And let's just review that final synthesis one last time, just to hammer home the speed and scale of that destruction.
The shift is unmistakable. For tea, China went from a 100% global monopoly to being surpassed by Indian exports by 1904. For rubber, Brazil controlled over 95% of the market. The Amazon economy was annihilated in less than 2 decades. And for cinchona, the Andean republics were completely marginalized as quinine became a cheap industrial product of Java and India.
The Wardian case just rewrote the economic and biological map of the world in under 75 years.
It really did.
So the story of the Wardian case is this monumental paradox. A deceptively modest technology, a wood and glass box on a ship's deck that broke the biological constraints of geography. It allowed empires to dismantle the natural monopolies of their rivals and literally reconstruct the botanical map of the world to suit their own interests.
And its legacy is profound and just unavoidable. It touches every facet of our modern lives, from the price and ubiquity of the tea we drink, to the cheap rubber in our car tires, to the very possibility that European settlements could even endure in the most forbidding tropical environments.
It saved millions of lives through the spread of affordable quinine, while at the same time enabling the exploitation and subjugation of the very regions where malaria reigned. It created immense wealth for imperial powers while annihilating the indigenous economies of the Amazon and China. Dr. Ward's accidental discovery in a polluted London garden didn't just save his ferns.
It enclosed the entire world in a glass case.
And that enclosure is what we should reflect on. We've seen how that genetic bottleneck, those 2,700 rubber seedlings, that single Cavendish banana, created massive global fragility in our food supply.
And the fundamental lesson is that when technology overrides geography for immediate economic gain, it often introduces profound, long-term ecological risks through homogenization and monoculture.
The scale of that historical decision is just staggering. We are living today in a world largely dictated by the resources that were moved or stolen in those small glass boxes 150 years ago.
Indeed. We should probably end by considering this. The Anthropocene, this age that we have defined by the irreversible impact of human activity on the planet, is, in many respects, a sprawling, fragile garden that was originally grown and cultivated inside a Wardian case.
That is powerful food for thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.